Thank you very much all for attending the side event. And as it already been said, we would like to talk about INDC implementation and look at it with regards also to how technology and capacity building can support it. And this comes at a very critical moment when we have some analysis have shown that there is still a gap that needs to be filled in between the current NDCs and the 2 degree, or even more so with the 1.5 degree needs for implementation. And I think the more discussions we have about how to advance implementation in this regard will see us getting closer to closing that gap. And technology and capacity building, I believe, are essential elements of that. And welcome all, and I believe and hope we will have fruitful deliberations to move us closer to implementation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dudu. I just forgot to introduce myself too. My name is Makoto Kato from the Overseas Environmental Cooperation Center of Japan. I am happy to serve as the moderator of this event today. Okay, we had two people, co-organizers of this event, to give our welcome remarks, but I would like to give the microphone back to John to start with the substantive part of your argument.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the other presenters will talk about, you could say, sort of the real substance of the activities, but I would like to share 2 or 3 areas that I'm sort of thinking about right now, following up on the Paris Agreement and the work we've been doing for a long time. At UNEP DTU partnership, we've been doing an awful lot of support for capacity building under the convention, back from the first national communications, other national communications, NAPAS, and also involved in the support program right now for national communications and BURs. Plus, what we're going to talk about today is a long series of activities around technology needs assessment and technology action plans that Sara will tell you about. We worked with 34, 35 countries that finished the process a couple of years ago, and we're currently working with another 24 countries, and we're starting a sort of maybe final round with another 25 countries next year, all with support from the Global Environment Facility. And as long as I've been, it's interesting to observe the changes over time in terms of understanding capacity building and also the role of technology. And if we link it with Paris, I mean, last year we also got Jeff's support to work with 35 countries in terms of assisting them in preparing their NDCs. There was a lot of LDCs and island states, so a lot of countries with relatively limited data and institutional capacity, but I mean, they all managed to submit, which I think is pretty good INDCs, but still, I mean, what we could see is also that there's a lot of work to be done after Paris in terms of integrating that. Because one thing is that you've submitted your INDCs and you stated your intentions, but a lot of the work underlying it in terms of integrating it into national development planning and so on is still something to be done. Many countries are working on it. We're continuing with all 35 countries on some, you could say, some leftover money from that Jeff allocation and covering some immediate priorities, but it's clearly something. But I think it's important for essentially everybody to understand that if you want to be serious about the INDCs and the NDCs, it becomes an integral part of national development, the national development plan. You cannot have an alternative climate plan that you send to Paris and then you go home and do as you normally do. So I think it's really a conceptual shift in terms of what we're looking at. That, of course, is something that's going to take some time because it is a complicated process to do. We had a meeting of the current countries of the TNA or TAP program in Nairobi, I guess 6 weeks ago or something like that. And it was quite interesting to hear from these 24 different countries how they've managed that process in terms of how they were linking the activities with the TAP processes with the NDCs. It wasn't happening in all the countries. Some countries really had a very strong integration. In other countries, it simply hadn't been done for internal institutional reasons. And I think we'll hear some of the better examples here today about how the work on technology is contributing, linking into the NDC process, which I think ideally it should, but there is often different institutional interest, some inertia in most countries also, and of course some of this takes time. And for some it was a very rushed process last year preparing the INDCs, and I'm sure you'll hear more about that from the countries when they present. The second point I just want to put on the table, and think we can come back to it in the panel discussion, is that I think with the Paris Agreement, I think a lot of the capacity building that we've been doing and a lot of other agencies have been supporting has, if you're a little bit sort of cynical about it, it's been about doing products. It's been doing about the national communication, about the NAPA, about the technology action plan. It has not been about a consistent process of building institutional capacity for certain specific processes to be continued. And I think with the Paris Agreement and the commitments all the countries have made in that context, I think it's important to see a shift on capacity building also. And I think it's also coming here, and I hope it'll be part of the decision coming out of here, that you're going for a more integrated and holistic approach to capacity building. Because I think a lot of what has been done has been fine in its own right, but it's often something that just has an end stop and in your report, and the people working on it in the countries go back to other work. And I think it's sometimes that capacity is lost because they're put to work on other things afterwards. But I think if you look at the new issues coming, and technology is clearly one of them, it's going to be something where you build up continued processes and institutional structures that really need to be self-sustained over time. Another area we're working on is transparency, which is kind of new, coming strongly out in the Paris Agreement. But again, I mean, it's not about delivering a transparency report in 2 or 3 years. It's about building a national system, you could say, reporting, and in the end, I mean, also reporting to the convention whenever it's decided how to report it and what. So it's initially it's for domestic purposes, but you really need to build up structures that can convey that activity into the future. And a lot of capacity building support is probably needed in the beginning, but I think countries have to see it as something where they gradually take over responsibility and in the end have to run their own processes in the longer term. So I think it's basically a mind shift around how capacity building has been done. And as I said, it's not a critique of what's been done because that's the way it was set up and it was the logical in a period where there was no commitments. But I think with the changes of engagement, I think it's also something that will change that concept. I just want to put these two things on the table, and maybe some of the other ones will agree and disagree, but then we can come back in the panel discussion at the end of it and see also if what you think and if other people have ideas about how to do this.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Rob, John. Well, surely we come back to those points during our panel discussion. Okay, Dudu, can you also start talking about your substantive part for technology needs support for NDC implementation, please?
Thank you, Makoto. Now talking about technology, technology needs support for NDC implementation. I will just talk briefly about what we did in Swaziland and how we see it how we see our technology needs assessment supporting NDC implementation. We are one of the countries where we are fortunate to have some of these processes happening under basically one roof, and the INDC and the TNA were being done under the same roof, and we had the teams working together. And in doing that, we even had some of our consultative processes at the same time, because also coming from a small country, you find that then the people, when you keep calling them today and calling them again for another similar process, a few weeks later, it becomes exhaustive and you might end up losing participation. So it became useful for us to hold some of the consultation processes together. And what then transpired when you look at our NDC and look at our TNA, you can see some overlaps. And like, just to give briefly what we have for the INDC under adaptation, we have we have biodiversity and ecosystems. We also have the water sector. For these two areas, we are mainly looking at policies and strategies. And then we also have the agriculture sector. mitigation side, we have the energy sector where it's mainly looking at doubling the renewable energy mix by 2030 compared to the 2010 baseline. And then the transport sector where we're looking at ethanol blending of 10%. And then the industry sector where we're looking into eliminating the current ODS substitutes. Now, when you go now into our TNA process, which we have prepared the TNA report itself, and we are now doing, we have now prioritized and are going into the barrier analysis. If you look into it, you can see the overlaps mainly in the adaptation. In the adaptation area, you see that we prioritized diversity, which is a similar thing that you can see in the INDC, and also the water sector and the agriculture sector. And when you come to the mitigation, it's mainly the energy, it's the energy sector that overlaps with what we have in the NDC. But in addition to that, we have waste management and land use change and forestry that has technologies that have been prioritized there. Now, when you look at that, it tells you that for us, we see ourselves using the technology needs assessment process to facilitate the implementation of the INDC, because in that way, we're able to identify the technologies that we would need to actually implement our INDC. But having said that, that would not be the end to say now we have done the NDC and we have done our TNA to support the implementation of the NDC, but there are more things that need to be done. One of the things that we have identified that we need to have done is to have an actual implementation plan of our NDC, which would then have to tie up with what we are with the TNA process to say we also have a technology action plan, and now how do we bring that and have an implementation plan for the NDC. And in that implementation plan, we'd also need to address the capacity, the associated capacity needs, so that our capacity building, the capacity doesn't fall back, because then the whole thing will not be sustainable if we would just have do something and then you find that the capacity is not there. Actually, we might not even be successful in implementing it properly in a way that will see us achieve our priorities. And saying that it's not only just for the sake of doing it, but we are looking, if you look at our NDCs, it does also talk to some area, the areas that are prioritized also talk to our development needs, particularly when you come to the agriculture sector. Another area that we thought might need attention as we move forward is having an investment plan, because we are looking at the opportunities that are available under the convention in terms of finances. And also when we did our INDC as the conditionality, we did have a technology, finance and capacity building. So an investment plan becomes an important element for us to have. Also noting that some of the areas you might find that there are needs to identify financing broader than just looking at into one area. So we need to have that investment plan, and also a monitoring and evaluation a framework we need to have, because not just because we need to report under the UNEP-CCC process, but also for us to know how far ahead we are moving. We need to have that in a monitoring and evaluation plan, noting that the NDC process is not stagnant. We will, after 5 years, need to resubmit it again. But if we don't know how far we have moved, then we will not be able to submit progressively, and we might find ourselves being stagnant maybe in one point. So we find that critical, and those are some of the areas where we believe we still need support to move forward and make sure that our TNA process properly supports the implementation of our NDC. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Duduzile. It's very interesting to introduce your experience with disease things to be done from that one. But I think Swaziland entered into a probably new phase or new stage to go forward. Thank you very much. So now I would like to invite Sara to talk about the role of technology in reaching NDC target or and the current status targets? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Makoto. Well, I will present so much on the process of conducting a TNA, but more to give some insights to how countries actually see the contribution of technologies in reaching their targets, and more specifically to show some examples of how it has been reported in their INDCs or NDCs so far. So an analysis of the INDCs which were submitted by countries and the non-Annex 1 countries showed that close to all countries were mentioning the technologies and the international support for technology development and transfer. They also highlighted through the issues on technologies that they would need, that they have specific needs for technologies and that they have specific costs of implementing technologies in reaching their NDC targets. And finally, they also, a number of the countries reached or mentioned the technology needs assessment. And to put some numbers on these, 70% of the non-Annex 1 parties actually mentioned that they would require support for technologies. Almost half of the countries raised that for technologies, they would require R&D and innovation. And 30% of the countries mentioned technology needs, and 25% on the financing, some on the barriers, and some 18% of the parties actually mentioned specifically the technology needs assessment process. And just to give you some examples, obviously there are common elements of technology needs assessments and NDCs. For example, priority sectors would be the same. That's not a big surprise. That would most likely be the same if you look into national communications or other related documents. But we also see that not only there were similarities between sectors, but also actions identified within the sectors for those countries who have conducted their TNAs or are in the process of elaborating the TNAs. And specifically, we saw that there's a difference between the technology issues raised by small island development states and least developed countries compared to the general reporting of non-Annex 1 countries. So there is a higher weight from the LDCs and the SIDS on the requirements for technologies. And as you can see here, the green lines are the LDCs, the red ones are SIDS, and the blue ones are the percentage across non-Annex 1 countries. So this also shows that there is a high demand for technology support in the LDCs and SIDS countries. And that's also a message that is being uptaken, and that shows also in the technology needs assessment project that John was mentioning we're implementing, because the next phase of the technology needs assessments starting next year actually is focused only on LDCs and SIDS. So in that sense, that's also encouraging. And we saw that in the INDCs, for example, Nauru raised that to make progress on reaching their targets set in the INDC, they would require a technology needs assessment project or process, and they did not have that, but it's will actually be part of the next TNAs coming up next year, as we would actually also have Antigua and Barbuda in this phase of the technology needs assessment project. And just to show you some assessment of the priorities for the agriculture sector to compare with the TNAs and the actions which were prioritized, you can see here that there is a clear coherence between the different, they're called actions maybe in the INDCs, but in technology needs assessments, they're called technologies, but there are very high similarity between the actions that they are actually processes. And this would just be some examples of how we have seen that countries are actually working with their TNAs and integrating these within the process of elaborating their NDCs. We heard that already from Swaziland, that Swaziland had the opportunity for elaborating on the different processes in synchronization, and it's the same team to a large extent, I think, working on the different processes. So that's something that we see is happening also for Lebanon. We saw there's a large overlap between the teams and the working groups for the sectors who worked for the elaboration of that technology needs assessment. And it was also the same working groups working on the preparation of their NDC or INDC. And just lastly, one reflection also coming out from the discussions here in Marrakesh is that on the discussions of the new technology framework, it's also encouraging to see that the views submitted on how the framework could be elaborated actually gives a high priority to technology needs assessments that can actually support NDC implementation. And just as a short summary, it becomes evident also looking at the numbers that technology is take a significant role in the implementation of the NDCs, or in the road to reach the targets, you could say, and that it remains to be a key issue, and also in the discussions going on here on the technology framework.
Thank you very much, Sara, for the presentation. I think before going to the other presentation, maybe we may have one or two technical questions to clarify what Sara argued here. It's very interesting to oversee different countries, and then there's a very interesting trend that SIDS and LDCs are especially in need of technology support, and I think that's really relevant to people here tonight. And then, if there is anything you want to clarify at this point of time, I would like to invite one or two questions only here. Not so far. Okay, please. Thank you.
Elaborate more on how do you handle this issue on the working, exactly two bodies are working at the same time? What kind of institutional setting you have set up so that those two bodies are working at the same time? Because sometimes in some countries it's an issue that more they want to have two entities, and most of them are not working at the same times, and it's not easy for the country to elaborate or to deliver on time.
Thank you. Dudu, please.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think for us, the fortunate part was that both the NDC and the TNA and the TNA were being coordinated from the same office. So it was easy for the teams, although we are basically one team, but it was easy to sit together and plan the work together, and also in mobilizing the stakeholders, mobilizing them in a way that will allow you to see the different processes going on at the same time. I think it was just that advantage that we had that helped us move forward. But if the two processes are in two different institutions, then it might need more collaboration between those two institutions to be able to do that, which might sometimes be problematic. Yeah.
I guess, well, in the case of Swaziland, we are basically very lucky that you have controlled the two things. But yeah, well, if there are two different offices, probably, well, there's an extra difficulties. still, how you coordinated these two different processes, I think it's very interesting to share with others. Thank you very much, Dudu. All right. Is there any other question at this time? Okay. So now I would like to move on to another African friend presentation. Marilia, Telma Antonio Manjate. She is the national focal point of Mozambican government. And then she was responsible for preparation for Mozambique's INDC. And now she is coordinating the National Technology Needs Assessment process in Mozambique. So I would like to invite you to start your speech.
Thank you for inviting us to come and share our experience on these two processes. I will start my presentation giving some information about the national circumstance of Mozambique. Mozambique is located in the southern east coast of Africa. We have about 700,000 square kilometers, and also we have a long coastline which is about 2,800 kilometers. The population is about 26 million. The GDP in 2015 was $509 US, and the GDP growth rate in 2013 also was 6.6%, and now the projection will drop a little bit to 3.9. The contribution sector in the GDP is 23.8 for agriculture, livestock, and forest, and 19% for energy, natural gas, and water, dependent on agriculture and the natural resource in their survival. The population with access to electricity, it's about 28.1%. These exclude the renewable energy. Mozambique is vulnerable to climate change due to its location in relation to intertropical convergence zone, and also it's in downstream of shared watershed, and it's also have a long shoreline with extensive lowland below sea level. Also, Mozambique has a low adaptive capacity and the limited investment in modern technology and the weakness infrastructure and social service, especially those related to health and sanitation. The impact of climate change in Mozambique is drought, floods, and tropical cyclone that results in loss of life and property, loss of crops, destruction of social and economic infrastructure. We have more or less the same institutional arrangement for climate change like Swaziland in Mozambique. The Minister of Land, Environment and Rural Development is responsible in coordinating the climate change within the country. It's an institutional focal point. And we have a national climate change team where we have representatives from the government sector, government institution, NGOs, and also private sector. And this climate change team is responsible to coordinate all the activity that we are implementing in the country, which meaning that for the INDC and also for the TNA is this team that is coordinating the work. Although we do have some subgroup that is dealing with the sector that we are involved in, we are considering in our TNA. Relating to the INDC, our INDC, it's a conditional. We've covered adaptation and mitigation component, and for the time frame of 10 years, which is from 2020 to 2030. And adaptation, our INDC includes the strengthening of the NAP process, and specifically, now here I'm highlighting those sectors related to the sector that we are covering also in our 10-year. We have in our INDC increased the effectiveness of land use and the spatial planning, protecting the floodplain, area vulnerable to floods. We have increased the resilience of agriculture, livestock, and fishing, guaranteeing the adequate level of food security and nutrition. We also have in our INDC developed resilient climate mechanism for infrastructure in urban area and other human settlement and the tourism and the coastal zone. For mitigation, our INDC cover the energy sector, which is electricity, and also the land use change and the forestry. We are going to implement our RED strategy, and also the waste. Our INDC action is policy and the program action that we are going to implement. Thus, the proposed outcome of the TNA process is in line with our adaptation and mitigation issue contained in our INDC. As it is stated in our INDC that the means of implementation for the sector covered by the TNA process will now be integrated in our INDC. As I say, our INDC is conditional with the means of implementation which cover technology, capacity building, and finance. As I say, Mozambique has developed a TNA covering adaptation. The sector is agriculture, coastal zone, and the infrastructure. The mitigation is in energy and waste. Prioritized technology in this sector will be full considered when we are updating our NDC. I would like to say that the challenge that we are having also is that for the process of TNA, we have to select 3 technology. But in the process of the TNA, we've identified 13 technologies. So the challenge is, how are we going to also to do the barriers analysis, all those processes on TNA to cover the other technology that are not covered within this TNA process. And also the capacity building, it's another challenge that we are facing. We need not only to access the technology, but also to build our capacity. And thank you.
Thank you very much. Here there is another interesting crossover of technology and capacity building and technology and INDC. Get the synergy of these different processes. Now, I would like to invite Walia from Antigua Barbuda to introduce capacity building needs for implementing nationally determined contributions, experiences from Antigua Barbuda.
Thank you, Makoto. And good evening, everyone. Although I have a nice technology up on the slide, I'm actually talking about capacity building. So capacity building in the context of getting to that point. And because my colleague Marilia started off with some stats about her country, I'll start off with some description of Antigua and Barbuda because it's very different contexts. So Antigua and Barbuda is in the Eastern Caribbean, a population of just under 100,000 people, independent country, and it's part of an economic union in the Eastern Caribbean. Our economy is primarily tourism-based, approximately 1 billion per year, and GDP about 5,000 US per person. Very vulnerable to hurricanes, droughts, sea level rise, flooding, all of these issues. And so in that context, the NDC targets are very important to helping us adapt to these circumstances. So first of all, if we're looking at capacity building for NDC, what sectors does our NDC cover? And we have both adaptation and mitigation. Mitigation covering your suite of renewable energy, energy efficiency, waste to energy, sequestration of ecosystems, and transportation. In adaptation, we're looking at water sector, built infrastructure, ecosystem services, off-grid renewables as a resilience strategy, and affordable insurance. And across these different issue areas, there's public, there's private sector, and there's community groups and NGOs who are relevant to the different areas. So it's a really broad-based and encompassing aspect. So here we have some climate change studies started in 2002. Our climate change policy framework was in 2001. And just to flick through some of the studies that have been done to get to this point where we have these different established and a need to now implement them. And the latest one being a workforce development strategy to implement NDC targets, identified what some capacity building training needs to get there. So we have a lot of studies. Each study had its own consultation process and got people engaged and identified priorities. And so I think returning to some of these challenges of consultation, fatigue in countries, and now we're ready for action, and our stakeholders are as well. So capacity building needs to bridge this gap between identification of issues and workshops and discussions to dealing with the big issues. This waste to energy, this is the landfill, and this is a significant, one of the most impactful sources of emissions, which UNEP DTU helped analyze our emissions impact of our NDC targets and found this to be one of the most impactful to start bridging this gap into action. So to do that, what has been helpful so far? Investing in local leaders and leadership has been really important. So finding your actors on the ground and working with them, and even with the Department of Environment, which is who I'm with and probably should have said in the beginning, finding allies in the climate change, in the other agencies. Direct access has been an important capacity building factor. The Department of Environment was accredited to the Adaptation Fund in 2015, and that has really allowed a lot of readiness support going to build capacity in a more integrated and sustainable way. So instead of the one-off product, we're now looking at more longer-term structures. So Green Climate Fund is the one we're now scoping out and seeking accreditation and projects to access those. And then short and responsive technical assistance. This has been really a gap that UNEP DTU has filled. Other like Clean Energy Solution Center, where the UNEP DTU really and the INDC and the kind of institutional arrangements and Clean Energy Solution Center in terms of we have this urgent need to develop a document and we do not have the internal capacity to do this as we take on new responsibilities. So some of those short-term assistance is very important. Country-driven implementation is where we're going. We have a national coordinating mechanism legislated last year to implement all of the multilateral agreements that Antigua and Barbuda signed on to. It's becoming operational, but we have a project management committee from our big global environment, full-size global environment facility project that's been very effective, and a technical advisory committee, and I'll go into the structure of those. But working within these frameworks has been key to get longer-term buy-in from the different agencies. All the sectors that the NDC is now working in. We have to work with the public utility, anything renewable energy related, physical planning authority, anything built infrastructure related. So this is the requirement of on the ground. So there has to be capacity now in all of these areas. And that is where the direct access comes into action. Having had a lot of benefited from a lot of support, the Department of Environment is now identifying, going to the physical planning authority to say, okay, what are your needs to help us implement a watershed scale project? And we had an interesting story come up where we've been inviting the physical planning authority to workshops on geographic information systems, GIS, for about 6 years to do GIS training for mapping. We went over and did a needs assessment, and no GIS is happening because of issues of not enough the software is not, they cannot get the software license because of a prohibitive cost to the GIS license. And so I think that's a really important thing of understanding, going and sitting and understanding the needs in the different agencies, and all of them will be very different. So some key takeaways. What do we mean by capacity building? I think we tend to fall in this workshops mode. Workshops cannot be the end in and of themselves. They're a means to get to the implementation and the real impact on the ground. Because even with all of our NDCs implemented, we're still heading to a 3.2 degree world, according to the latest UNEP emissions gap report. And we know that SIDS and everyone in the Paris Agreement, now 1.5 is what we're striving for. So capacity building is critical because it's a universal agreement and everyone's taking on new commitments to ratchet up the global ambition. So the need to be less prescriptive. I think in initial discussions with the capacity building initiative for transparency, some of what we have identified as urgent needs don't fall within the scope of the CBIT. And so what does capacity building mean in that context? Surely it should be a country-driven process. And then finally, direct access kind of approach. I think we've noticed when we do receive support, when there is some engagement in terms, sometimes, you know, an expert can get parachuted in to help work on the ground. And when there is a process of engagement with local stakeholders, even looking at different options to have experts and some kind of engagement at that level, at that initial selection, it can really help the buy-in with the stakeholders. So I think we have some meaningful progress so far. In Antigua and Barbuda, we're benefited by a small scale country, so our stakeholders just have to drive a little way to get to us. And we need to now look at really building up and implementing the agreements through technology needs assessments, which we have not done yet, and all of the other work to implement NDCs. So thank you very much.
Thanks for your presentation. I think this is another very interesting example, and you're very successful, especially, well, these key takeaways. Well, these are relevant, of course, for the capacity building needs are probably diverse. Depending on countries, but I think still, well, what you propose are very relevant here. Thank you very much for sharing with us. Okay. To raise the question, okay, here. Could you? The microphone is coming now.
My name is Manjate from the Gambia. I think the name of the country was shown on the Sara slides. Gambia. I just want some clarification because I came a little bit late. If I can understand, Swaziland, you are on TNA, just like the Gambia. Am I right? Okay. You have done yours.
No Western.
You are on it. Okay. You people are yet to have it. Okay. That's what I want.
Well, it's very important to take a stock of our current situation. Okay, thank you very much for that, for the clarification. Are there any other clarificatory questions here? All right, so we have excellent presentations. Thank you very much for all of you. And now I would like to invite Jukka to join in the stage. From now on, we would like to start panel discussion, but perhaps we have those two gentlemen. One is Jukka, and then the other one is Remco. Okay, I would like you to start with your self-introduction. I think, Jukka, you're too famous. Everybody knows about you, probably. But I would like to invite you to introduce yourself, especially on behalf of the CTCN. Please. Okay. Just briefly.
Okay, thank you very much. No, so my name is Jukka Uosukainen. I'm the director of the Climate Technology Center and Network. This is a new baby in the climate convention family. It was established quite many years ago, but it started operations 2 years ago, and its main purpose is serving developing countries on any of their climate technology issue, concern, question, whatever they have in their minds. Of course, we wish them to be very much prioritized, as we heard from countries here, that they are having a good processes on screening out what are their priority questions to the convention. And we are that convention body which is answering directly to the parties through their national designated entities. And we try to get from our consortium and from our network, which is 250 strong institutions around the world, the best expertise to answer those questions, to make those plans, to make feasibility study, to help the countries to make a right climate proposal, investment proposal to funding agencies and so on. So that's in a nutshell. There is a big story behind, and there is of course, our websites are open for your scrutiny.
Thank you very much, Jukka, for your nice introduction. And I also would like to invite for Remco to introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for the invitation to join the panel. I'll probably do a little bit of intro on myself, and then I'll just give a couple of observations so people understand where I'm coming from, which is a bit different from what we've heard so far. So I work for a platform called the UNEP Finance Initiative, which is a UNEP run of largely private sector commercial financial institutions. So that's commercial banks, commercial investment firms, and insurance companies, both in developed as well as in developing countries. And what we try to do is understand what is the role of this sector, which is at the heart of today's market-based economy everywhere, in facilitating development that is sustainable, meaning low carbon and climate resilient in this context today. So, and part of that work, of course, we've been looking at what is the role of financial institutions in implementing NDCs, what is the role in financing the components of NDCs. I've got a couple of four points that I'd like to get across. If that's okay, I'll be very brief, or a couple of insights that might be interesting for this discussion. The first one is when we talk to the private sector and to private sector FIs, when we talk to them about an NDC, how we frame it is basically a timeline. Technologies that are obsolete and not very efficient will have to phased out, and newer technologies will have to be phased in. And it's not only technologies, infrastructures and business models. This is how we frame it. And then we tell them there are 4 critical stakeholders in making sure NDCs get implemented effectively. 2 of those stakeholders are on the public side of things, and 2 of the other stakeholder groups are on the private side of things. The public stakeholders are policymakers, regulators, legislators, governments, which you find at the national level in developing countries, also in developed countries, but also in developing countries. And of course, you have the international regime embodied, through this process. Here, you then have public financial institutions, multilateral, unilateral, national. And on the private side, you have private enterprise in the real economy, so those who are actually importing, introducing, operating technologies and infrastructures. And then you have the financiers, the private sector financiers, those financing, providing the financing. And for an NDC ultimately to work, all these different stakeholders need to work together. And this is, one main point. And it's especially the role, I think, of the 2 public sector stakeholders to, as we have all known from decades of work on development, to rather than investing and implementing technologies and operating technologies themselves, that they put in place the enabling conditions for that. And that they steer the market actors, the technology people and the finance people towards where they need to go. One recommendation that we make, and this is my final point, we can discuss more about these different roles, but what we've found in analyzing the policies that are being put in place to steer the private sector and mobilize private financing are not always the most effective ones, and they're not always the most efficient ones. And the reason for that is that very often when policymakers or people on the public side of things are designing their interventions, their policies, regulations, financial instruments, they're not very methodical. They're not sufficiently nuanced in terms of what it is that they want to achieve. So we propose a step-by-step approach in designing policies for NDC implementation, which starts with what is it on the ground that you'd like to achieve? Is it a large-scale grid-based renewable energy plant, that's going to cost hundreds of millions of US in a, emerging economy, or is it small-scale technologies in these developed countries. Start, and then you analyze, what kind of financing do you need for that? Do you need microfinance funds? You need to mobilize large infrastructure funds, etc. And then you build yourself up towards the barriers and the policy solutions. And if you follow that kind of approach, we're sure that the policy interventions that are designed will be far more impactful. I'll stop there. So
great.
We can carry on.
Thank you very much, Remco, for your very interesting start in the argument of how finance will be mobilized through public and then private sector partnership. Great. Now, I would like to introduce 4 guiding questions. The Secretariat, UNEP DTU, actually gave me 4 guiding questions. Well, of course, you have you don't really have to limit yourself to answer to those guiding questions, but I would like to pose some questions to you. First, here, we saw different cases of INDCs and then TNAs, and also technology intervention and also capacity building. And then everybody is now trying to prepare for the implementation of NDCs. But now we would like to see what are actions necessary, or what are important topics you have to start with by introducing technologies and capacity building support. Perhaps for maybe Leah, can you start? I think you can extend with your presentation and then your argument. I think there are lots of things to be done from now on, but.
Sure. So I think with capacity building support for technologies, one of the things that, to be totally frank, that we need to have some kind of as we are opening things up, and I think this gets to the stepwise process of having a methodology to do it, having safeguards in place so that as we identify opportunities, that we have kind of a equal opportunity for all technologies. One of the things we found is that standards getting put in place can privilege certain interests in the technologies that you're putting in place. So capacity building for technologies, those clear opportunities for a balanced approach. And this is, as we look to, as a small island state, we're very limited public sector. And when you have multinational companies approaching, I mean, the asymmetry of capacity and of information, it's daunting. And it's been very helpful to have people to reach out to and stakeholders. But I think capacity building inherently comes with where are the interests in getting the work done? And that is just kind of a first take on that question in terms of as we move forward to directly rolling out technology needs and so on, that we've been aware of in Antigua and Barbuda. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. Especially for small island countries, challenges are probably especially big. But I think with capacity building and also technology support, there are lots of things we can address at least, and then perhaps teaming up for different stakeholders within and outside the government. I think that's something where we can move forward. Especially for the preparation for the implementation of capacity INDC. Yeah. Yes, please. Yeah.
Just to add on that, that's the technology needs assessment.
Sure.
Right. Is
sure.
Looking at your range of options. So I think just in terms of identifying the problem, but I also wanted to say recommending the solution. Thanks.
I think it's a very important process to see different options and then also have a broad view in in a glance. And then I think then governments and stakeholders and private sector can use it for equal status of the different technologies. I think it's an excellent opportunity for all of us to do. All right, and then also I would like to pose the same question to Marilia in the context of Mozambican experience. Well, you have done INDC, and now you're in the process of TNA. And then how do you link these two different processes? I think there are lots of overlap and then crossover. And I think now I think you're planning to do very interesting things in Mozambique. But can you share a little bit about what you want to deal with? How to deal with these two different processes?
The challenge that we have experienced in Mozambique to implement this process of technology need assessment and also the INDC, and where we really need to build our capacity is to involve the private sector and also the government, as she say, the enabling environment that will really allow the private sector to get in this process of access the technology. And as we have started, as I say in my presentation, we do have a private sector, but the country is too big. Really, we didn't have enough opportunity to go even in the region to, how can I say, to mobilize the private sector for this process. And also, as I said in my presentation, the other thing that we are getting a challenge is in the technology need assessment, we do have to select only 3 technology to add analysis, but there are also other technology that have been identified in the process that we think that it's important for us to implement our NDC. And now we will need to do also the same analysis for those other technology so that we can be in position to say, how are we going to implement those technologies that have been identified in our technology need assessment, especially for our NDC. As I say, we are going to use the result from the technology need assessment for our NDC.
Thank you. Well, are there any colleagues here similar experience in your national context? Involvement of the private sector, everybody says it's important, but it's not really easy thing. Do you know that? Yes, please.
Yeah, I concur with my colleague from Mozambique that it's not really easy to involve the private sector. So it definitely needs a lot of capacity building and also needs maybe some approaches as a recommendation from UNEP to say that maybe the way we policies, somehow it might not be methodical to be in compliance or to be in line with what the private sector would want to see, because we might have our targets, but maybe we're not able to marry them with what our economy can chew in terms of moving forward step by step to ensure that we achieve what is practical. So I think it's something that we might also need to deal with. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your point. Yes, please.
Thank you. just perhaps a sort of clarification, just to, I mean, you mentioned the importance of in the barrier analysis process and the enabling framework process, not on the private sector, which is totally right. But I think it's important also to realize that enabling the framework also means the involvement of the state, of the government, because you have regulatory frameworks that needs to be in place, put in place, so you can. So TAP is an implementation which is not only funded by the private sector, but it could be also nationally funded.
Do any of you want to respond to that point?
Perhaps because
all right, please. Yeah.
Because people are referring to the private sector, and this is to a certain extent a constituency that we work with in a very focused way. So on that point, the private sector, neither the private sector in the real economy, so in the sectors of electricity, agriculture, you name it, nor the private sector in the financial economy, the banks and insurance companies and pension funds, they will not take care of climate change by themselves. This is clear. I mean, climate change, economists call climate change a market failure, and that's for that reason. So definitely it is the role of the public sector to steer, as I said in the beginning, the private sector where society wants the private sector to go. This is the best framing, and what the public sector needs to be able to do that, I think, is knowledge and an understanding. You need to understand how your private sector in the sectors of your country, how they operate, what their objectives are, so that you can steer them where you want them to go. And of course, you want to avoid situations where you have information asymmetry, where you as the government are in a situation where private interests are basically to influence you too heavily simply because of information asymmetries. That's a given that needs to be addressed first as well. So,
all right, thanks. Okay, Dudu and also Kato, please.
Okay. Thank you. I think one observation that I've made is that also in trying to engage the private sector, they are very time conscious. They don't want to sit there talking about something that they don't see how it add value to their business, which makes it difficult because, like, for some of the sectors where they now understand how climate change is affecting the future of their businesses, they become more willing to participate, although you still need to understand that time is of essence to them. But for some of the sectors, you find that it's still difficult to get them to sit down because probably you're still trying to explain how their sectors are affected, but it still hasn't gotten to that point. Now, as Remco has said previously, that for us in the private sector, there is still that need for capacity building in terms of how we structure our policies and other relevant documents in a way that will attract the private sector and wants them to participate, because we need them to own some of these action plans that we are talking about, because as government, in some of the areas, we do not have the full capacity to implement on our own, but we need to have that partnership with the private sector. For example, some of these issues, they need technologies that cannot be fully driven by the public sector because the business itself it's in the hands of the private sector, and there's that need for collaboration. So I think the issue of capacity building, we need not look into it just limited to the technology aspects of it, but as it already been said, the policy and enabling environment.
Jukka, please.
Yeah, maybe I answer a couple of questions which you have put on here. One is that we have now a beautiful tool, technology tool on our hands under convention. And this is, and especially I would like to say top technology action plans, because they actually are a kind of technology roadmaps for the specific prioritized technology fields which the country itself has chosen, And those exactly have to be supportive to NDCs, of course. I mean, now the horse has to be in front of the carriage, the elephants in the room. And the technology planning has to support that country commitment which is coming. But it is exactly the TAPs which can provide that tool for a longer-term technology planning of the country for the priority areas. And there indeed we come to this issue that who are going to roadmaps and who are going to be committing to them. And that is exactly the question of partnership, that there has to be governments leading, but there has to be partnership of the private sector and financiers. And that means that it has to be national financiers involved, and every single, and of course the other stakeholders guaranteeing the quality of the plans. And this has to be something which the 3-party or 4-party stakeholders will commit together with milestones, with concrete milestones, that what kind of technology will be imported or developed, how the academia will be supporting it, how the research centers are coming in, what, and who is doing the legislative and regulatory changes which has to be there. If government is not doing its own job, private sector is not going to do anything for that one. Look what happened when Germany announced that 2030 there will be no fossil fueled vehicles in the country. What a signal a government can do for the private sector markets. That is what governments can do. They give a long-term signal to that what kind of markets are there in 20 years' time or 10 years' time in that country. And then the private sector understands the signal and starts working. So I'm really happy that we had this TAP guidelines last year, and now it is very much into use for implementing and supporting the implementation of INCs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jukka. John, would you like?
Yeah, I had 2 points. One of them has been taken over by Jukka partly already, but I'm going to rephrase it a little bit, but say the same things. So I think what everybody is saying up here on the panel about private sector engagement is it doesn't happen by itself. I mean, sometimes it's used as a catchword, but they've all been saying is that you need a clear political framework with a role for what the private sector can contribute. And then as Jukka described, you need long-term policies and vision, be it like in Germany regulation where you say you cannot do this kind of thing after that date, or you change the efficiency of fuel efficiency in certain countries right now, or you use economic instruments, whatever is the right tool for the right purpose in terms of what you want to achieve. But it comes with a stable policy framework that's really long-term, because then companies are going to look, and countries internationally look at countries' INDCs around the world and look at where are the best opportunities to invest their money also when they come from outside. So it's very much looked at, and don't underestimate that that's actually something that really looking at the INDCs to see where is the potential market coming and where should we move our money if we have the possibility to invest. So it's something that's really there. Ability, I'll say, to respond to it. And then, of course, government can help remove some of the barriers, which we also pay a lot of attention to in the TAP guidance and so on. I wanted to say something slightly different, but I think when I started my first intervention, I talked a lot about the need for integrating the action and the capacity building at the national level. And I think we heard 3 really excellent examples how that's happening. I mean, we worked with all 3 countries on different occasions, and it's really a process where you can see that integration coming over time, and I think it's really nice to see. I think what would be really nice if we could see the same on the support side, not really seeing that happening. Well, I mean, there are positive movements. I'll give you one example, and one of the reasons that Jukka and Remco up here now is to try and show how we're trying, at least within UNEP, to try and combine some of the things. Because when we did the first round of TNA and TAP support with their action plans, and they were basically sitting, so where should we take them? I mean, what are the likely taker that can help us develop these activities into concrete activities? The NDC and INDC framework hadn't even been invented or thought about at the time. 3 years ago, I mean, nobody had used the term INDCs. Of course, you knew something that had to be done over time. But then, as Jukka said, then at least one of the options to help on that was the creation of the CTCN. So now that we're working in the second round, I mean, at the end of it, the first round countries really saw the opportunity coming in CTCN, and you can maybe talk to some of the requests coming from countries that quite a lot of them actually come out of the first round of TNAs and TAPs. But in the current process, it's much easier because now you can see the linkage. building effort resulting in a plan where you can take the priorities, you know where you can take them, and you can get support to develop them into something that contributes to the NDC. A little bit of what I'm talking about in terms of having more continuous and interlinked processes. So it doesn't come as one big package, at least to ensure that the different parts are linked together. And I was trying to get into the session this afternoon about CTCN and GCF. I don't know if you want to talk about it or if it's too political, but I mean, again, linking the technology support and the technical assistance with the potential financing. Because I think countries shouldn't really think about that we need to have one project here and then the next little project and the next one, because I mean, that's an enormous waste of time and resources on the countryside, which is a scarce resource. So I think we're doing a little bit to try and do it, but it's a complicated world also on the supply side. And then, of course, you have all the bilaterals in parallel with a lot of this. So we're trying, and then maybe you can talk a little bit to it also if you want to.
Okay.
No, just to say that more than half of the technical assistance requests we have far, over 150 of them, have been coming through the TNA process. So in a way, those countries who have carried out TNA process have been more active in bringing these assistance requests to us, and that's logical. And we, of course, we are very happy because that means that country has prioritized their to us. On if you want me to say something about the how to mobilize financing, we are also very kind of cautious and almost concerned that if we give technical assistance to country worth of, let's say, $100,000 or $200,000, we bring experts or we use country experts or regional experts, it has to result to an impact, some kind of tangible impact that government does something with that technical assistance input. And very often that input is a bankable, fundable project proposal, either for public funds or the private funds. We try to bring the country into a high-quality project proposal, which has got at least technology risks being scrutinized. We can't, remediate all the risk of financing, climate financing, but at least we are technology body, so we have to be able to at least sort out that what could be those best technologies in that particular country circumstances, countries with. And in that sense, it's also very, very good for us together with the countries to kind of specify that what kind of economic benefits is going to happen if this adaptation project or this mitigation project is going to be implemented with the collaboration with governments and private sector and communities. Who is benefiting? It can be adaptation project where there are beneficiaries which are ready to pay for protecting their assets, protecting their properties, and so on. We have to find the kind of economic sides of the climate projects and technology assistance. The same is mitigation usually is always a business case. There is always some kind of business case in mitigation, and this has to be defined because when we take these projects into the financial institutions like Global Environment Facility or Green Climate Fund, they will ask that. Are we going to finance this purely for the grant basis, even if it's a power plant, if it's renewable power, or if it's a kind of a service, water supply service on the country? There has to be rate of returns, and this is very important. If you're asking that how to mobilize financing, the projects are kind of reasonable for financial institutions to finance. They will then do.
I agree. Well, always, we need to look at whether our proposals are hitting like a buy-in. If we are not selling our proposals for business or for public sector, technology needs assessment is unfortunately not really helpful. But I think now we are really aware about that, and I think CTCN is really helping that kind of activities. Yeah. Okay. Well, like to add something?
What I just wanted to say, like picking from what John said earlier on, that some of these ideas came up even before NDC, before we started talking about NDC. Just now coming from a tech perspective, just to say that there was guidance that was given years before that on how to link your TNAs with NAPs and mitigation and mitigation action, which now those are what in the current era, when we talk about NDC, we are talking about adaptation and mitigation, maybe not looking at the full that we have, but having prioritized some. But now it's that sort of guidance can still work today to say you are now using your TNAs and working together with the NDCs. So it's guidance that is available. It is there on the TT Clear that can be used by parties.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to invite you from the floor to raise questions or comments about what have been discussed by our panelists here. Well, any question is okay. Yes.
Again, from the Gambia, I want to correlate the RIP and the TNA, or the outcomes of the TNA, because the RIP, to my understanding, was designed for countries that are on the TNA process. If I stand to be quoted, right? But if you look at the funding for the Request Incubator Program, which is $50,000 to $250,000. I'm thinking of what about if a particular country has finalized the TNA, and yet still of that TNA is putting more emphasis on the same project proposal as in the request. How can we reconcile the two? Because maybe sometimes the $250,000 might be very small, and maybe countries might want to go very aggressively, like the guy from Mozambique. You have a problem of even reaching the inland of Mozambique, and this $250,000 US will be spent within a small region. But others might be interested who are far in. So I want some clarifications in this aspect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, maybe I should take another questions or comments before returning to the panelists. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Andrea Carpati from Climate Cake, and I was wondering whether you could give some examples and how practical examples on how you help the business sector, the private sector, to be able to act on climate change. And the background of the question is focusing on education, which we in our own practice found very useful and important in Europe to help businesses to start innovative and collaborative action and take their commitments on their own and implement them. So if you could just give some examples, how you're thinking, what is the next step down the line in implementing your NDCs?
All right, so there are two questions on the floor. Okay, Jukka, would you?
No, I can answer a bit of that, this question of TNAs, and then on the other half, at least if you meant the request incubator program we are carrying out, CTCN is. So we are provided LDCs, and then it's a kind of specific, a kind of handholding on looking at the technology priorities and bringing a important technology request to us, CTCN, in order to further work. And that was about actually $30,000 a kind of idea. That was actually, it was launched more than a year ago when we didn't get requests from countries at all. We were waiting there in the office in Copenhagen and nothing came out, you know, one request per month. And we were getting worried. So that's why we said that, okay, LDCs, please come up with some requests. You have to have problems in technology, that climate technology. So bring your problems to us. That's why we launched it, and we have been in some 13, 14 developing countries, LDCs, mainly in Africa, to help them to bring. And now you have done it. I mean, you are loading us with the technology requests. At the moment, we have coming 2 per week. A challenge now to answer those questions. So in a way, it has been success, that incubator program already. What comes to technology need assessments, we as a CTCN have said that let our friends in UNEP and elsewhere to do the TNA process through the GEF financing, like it has been done for many, many years. It's going through and so on. They know their business and so on. But if a country has dropped out and wants to do something like more technology need assessment like work in the country, we are ready to help. If the country asks us to help, we will help. We are totally country driven. The parties, we are under convention. We are not a kind of independent institution. We are there for help. So if a country comes and say that they want to have a TNA-like process, which they are not getting otherwise financing or expertise, then we can do it in a hopefully very focused way, exactly supporting the NDCs now, because NDCs are the new kid on the block. So let's serve that one, because everybody is focusing on that one. So whatever, we are ready to discuss this.
Thanks, Jukka. And to the question raised by my friend, maybe Remco.
Yes, I think the question was, how can countries actually engage, support their private sector more concretely? I think a metaphor was introduced earlier with a horse pulling the wagon, and I'll try to stick to that a little bit. I think the horse is the private sector, and the rider is the government, and the rider is legitimized to, you know, steer the horse wherever it needs to go. And how governments typically engage at some point with the private sector is with sticks and carrots. You know, this is how you get, you know, your horse going where you want it to go. And that means, you know, if you put that in policy or economic language, that's basically incentives and sanctions. This is what, you know, what the core instruments of regulation. And so I think it's at some point it's through those types of instruments that you will of course support and inhibit the private sector depending on where you would like to go. An example is another point is that at times, of course, in many developing countries will not have the types of carrots and sticks that they need, because they don't have the capacities and the financial resources needed for that. And this is, I think, where there's a role for the international community through vehicles like the GCF, for instance, and others, to help those developing country governments have those carrots and sticks that they need. One example of how you know, one example that's worked wonders in Europe in terms of steering the energy sector towards renewable energies is feed-in tariffs. You know, where if you produce a renewable energy and you put it into the grid, you'll be guaranteed a price that's higher than the market price. And that obviously, you know, this is a very nice example of a carrot. And then there are examples for sticks.
Stick and carrot. But of course, what we need to know, what kind of stick and carrot are we supposed to use? Okay. All right. Yeah. Yes, please.
If I just may add a little bit about regarding your question, how to sort of get the private sector involved. And this is something that we have in the TNA process and as a matter of fact, we have developed specifically a guide for guiding how to involve all the relevant stakeholders in the TNA process. And I think this is something that prevails as well for other processes, similar processes. And I think the key is to involve all relevant stakeholders from the very beginning, that including the private sector, so they can feel ownership and they can feel that they are part of the process. and then it's much easier to get them involved or engaged than otherwise. I mean, it's much more difficult to try to bring them in the end of the process, because they have not been part of the process, they don't feel ownership, so it's more difficult. The other mention is, I think it's quite important to understand the difference between adaptation and mitigation when it comes to funding. Because for a number of reasons, you may understand that the private sector is much more interested in mitigation than adaptation. So you have to have, well, perhaps not, it has been the case. Perhaps that is changing. But my view, at least, is that it is more difficult to get in the private sector when it comes to adaptation, funding adaptation, than funding mitigation. So, thank you.
So,
okay. Yes.
Sorry, maybe I can share also another experience that we have in Mozambique. We are developing our NAMA on the West sector, which involve the private sector and the NGOs. And then sometime on this process, what we did was the private sector and also the NGOs, they contact the entity for technology, asking him if he can help them to submit the proposal to the CTCN to access the technology that is suitable for us to implement this NAMA on West sector.
Thank you very much. I think, okay, so we have, okay, now I have Leah. Then after that, well, on behalf of the co-organizers, I would like to invite Dudu and then John to give final remarks. Okay, Leah first, please.
Thank you. Yes, very quickly weighing in as well, a shared experience was developing the workforce development strategy was very useful to provide a platform for understanding some of the local needs for skills, and also looking at the technologies and seeing in Antigua and Barbuda, we can train solar, installers, but wind, we would need to outsource. And that's clear. We don't have those capacities, and it doesn't make sense to do that. And so looking at like some of our diesel importers, how can we now retrain, like an element of retraining and providing local certifications? I think making that business case, which came up earlier, for what are the economic benefits that you'll see, that labor force element has been a really important next step for us in getting some of the next steps forward. Thanks.
Okay, Dudu, please.
Thank you very much. Maybe before the concluding remarks on the question of the private sector and building capacity on their side, one method that we have identified in Swaziland is also like trying to use the federations that they have and do the capacity building through those. But once again, that is where we also found that for them just to get their buy-in, you need that buy-in, and they need to understand how it relates to their business. And as it has already been said, that sometimes mitigation it can be easier to explain to them, but we've had, I think, during one of the sessions that we've had during the inter sessions, I'm trying to remember which one, whereby we had some private sector organization explaining to us how they are now being able to bring adaptation issues into the private sector by making them understand how they could possibly lose their raw material and then get that private sector to support adaptation in that area, because they will still need the raw material that is vulnerable to climate change. And having said that, I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone for the active participation. And I believe that we all have quite a lot to take home and process and see how we can improve the implementation of our NDCs, and taking into consideration that technology needs assessment and capacity building, and bringing everything together to make sure that we move forward, because like it has already been said, Mozambique, Swaziland, we have the means of implementation, which includes technology and capacity building as conditionalities for our NDCs, and I think a lot of other countries. So we need to make sure that these elements work together for us to move forward. Thank you very much.
Finally, John.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And yeah, I mean, it's a round of thanks. So, I mean, thank you for coming, for participating, for good questions and engaging. And thanks to you, Makoto, for doing a very nice moderation and making it this really a nice event. And of course, thanks to all the panelists up here, and especially thanks to Sara and whatever. I still have a problem with that because in Swahili it means something else. But for organizing the event, and I think it's been really interesting to be up here. So basically, I think when we finish this, you should give all of them a big hand. But before you do that, and while the sort of text is running down the screen, the adverts come. So basically, we have a new boss in UNEP that tells us that we should speak in languages that people can actually understand. So my old mother, she actually wants to, but this is a little nice thing that Sara and her colleagues have put together about the technology needs assessment, some real life stories in very sort of plain, simple language so that you can actually understand what's going on. And they should be available outside. I think there should also be a little bit of snacks and drinks out there, not too much because the prices here are quite honestly quite outrageous. But we did what we could within the budget. So if you can join us outside for that, and maybe as a last thing, give them a big hand.
Thank you very much for joining us. Then the meeting is over. Thank you.
Your last event.
No. I mean,
I saw your invitation. Negotiations. I mean, but